I understand that you're looking for more in-depth research. I'll gather comprehensive information on the topic you've specified, ensuring that it covers all relevant aspects and details. Please hold on for a moment as I compile a thorough response that meets your expectations. Entendi. Vou expandir o roteiro significativamente para atingir os 35.000 caracteres solicitados. Vou adicionar mais profundidade narrativa, desenvolvimento de personagens, cenas adicionais e detalhes históricos. Aguarde momento enquanto crio a versão expandida. Script: Eat first, I'll pretend I already ate. Expanded version: September 1945. The war was over, but the suffering wasn't. In a makeshift prisoner-of-war camp on the outskirts of Okinawa, hundreds of Japanese civilians and soldiers sat behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow, their bodies weak. The Americans had won, but victory tasted bitter when you looked into the faces of the defeated. Among those faces was Yuriko Sato, a 32-year-old widow clutching her 7-year-old son Kenji. As he coughed blood into a torn piece of cloth, she whispered the same lie she'd been telling for weeks. "Eat first, Kenji. I already ate." But Sergeant Frank O'Brien, the American cook ladling watery rice into tin bowls, knew better. He'd seen that look before, in his own mother's eyes during the Depression, when she'd skip meals so her children could eat. And it broke something inside him he didn't know could still break. The camp stretched across a muddy field that had once been farmland, now trampled into a gray wasteland by military boots and monsoon rains. Rows of tattered tents housed over 300 prisoners, mostly women, children, and elderly men. The younger men, the soldiers, were kept in a separate section behind double fencing, guarded more heavily by sentries with rifles and watchful eyes. The Americans had set up a mess tent near the center of the compound, a large canvas structure that smelled of boiled rice and rust from the metal cooking pots. Twice a day, at dawn and dusk, prisoners lined up for their rations. A tin cup of rice, sometimes a thin vegetable soup made from whatever the supply trucks brought in. Occasionally a piece of salted fish or a hard biscuit. It wasn't much, barely enough to sustain life, but it was more than many of these people had eaten in months, perhaps years. The island of Okinawa had been devastated by the battle that raged for 82 days, one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. Entire villages had been reduced to rubble, families torn apart, survivors left to wander through the ruins searching for loved ones who would never be found. When the Americans finally secured the island, they faced a humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands of displaced civilians, many of them wounded, starving, traumatized. The military set up camps like this one, temporary holding facilities where prisoners could be processed, identified, and eventually released or relocated. But the process was slow, bureaucratic, hampered by language barriers, and the sheer scale of the devastation. Yuriko Sato had been at the camp for 3 weeks when Frank O'Brien first noticed her. She'd arrived on a transport truck from the southern part of the island, one of dozens of refugees rounded up by American patrols. She carried Kenji in her arms, the boy too weak to walk, his small body burning with fever. Her husband, Hiroshi, had been a sergeant in the Imperial Army, stationed in the Philippines. She'd received no word from him since early 1944. No letters, no confirmation of his fate. In her heart, she knew he was dead, knew that he'd died far from home, probably in some nameless jungle, his body left to decay in the tropical heat. All she had left was Kenji, her only child, the last piece of her family, and he was dying. The boy had contracted tuberculosis, or perhaps it was pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition and exhaustion. The camp doctor, an overworked American medic named Lieutenant Peterson, had examined Kenji and given him some sulfa pills, but they weren't enough. The boy needed rest, warmth, proper nutrition, things that were in short supply in a prisoner-of-war camp. Peterson had done what he could, but there were hundreds of sick people in the camp, and he was only one man with limited supplies. He told Yuriko to keep the boy warm, to make sure he ate, and to pray. That was all he could offer. So Yuriko made a choice, the only choice a mother could make. Every meal she would take her tin bowl of rice, sit beside Kenji in their corner of the tent, and pretend to eat. She would lift the spoon to her lips, tilt it as if swallowing, then lower the bowl and quietly transfer the food to her son's bowl when she thought no one was watching. She told him she'd already eaten at the distribution line, told him she wasn't hungry, told him that the Americans gave extra rations to the cooks. and she'd had her fill. Kenji, too young and too sick to question her, believed every word. He ate what she gave him, slowly, painfully, his small hands trembling as he held the spoon. And every day, Yuriko grew weaker, her body consuming itself to keep her alive. Frank O'Brien noticed her on the 4th day of her stay. He was standing behind the serving line in the mess tent, a large man with broad shoulders and calloused hands, scooping rice from a massive pot that sat on a field stove. He'd been doing this job for 2 months now, ever since his unit had been assigned to camp duty after the fighting ended. It was monotonous work, mind-numbing, but it was better than combat. At least here, nobody was shooting at him. At least here, he could sleep at night without wondering if a mortar round would land on his foxhole. But the work wore on him in different ways. Every day he looked into the faces of the prisoners as they filed past, and he saw the same thing: defeat, despair, hunger. These weren't soldiers, not most of them. They were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, mothers with children. They were people who'd been caught in the machinery of war, ground down by forces beyond their control. Frank tried not to think about it too much, tried to maintain the professional distance that the military demanded. These were enemy civilians, he reminded himself. Their country had started this war, had attacked Pearl Harbor, had killed thousands of American boys. He'd lost friends in this war, good men like Eddie Kowalski and Tommy Chen, guys he'd trained with, fought beside, watched die. Why should he care if these people were suffering? They'd brought it on themselves. But then he saw Yuriko, and something shifted. She was standing in line, holding Kenji against her hip, the boy's head resting on her shoulder. She was thin, terribly thin, her cheekbones sharp beneath her skin, her eyes sunken deep in their sockets. Her hair, once probably thick and black, was now brittle and streaked with gray, though she couldn't have been more than 35. She wore a tattered kimono, faded and stained, tied with a piece of rope because the original sash was long gone. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Frank's attention. It was the way she looked at her son. There was a desperation in her gaze, a fierce, protective love that transcended language, culture, nationality. It was a look Frank recognized because he'd seen it before, in his own mother's eyes during the Great Depression, when his family had nothing, and his mother would go without so her children could eat. Frank filled Yuriko's bowl with rice, handed it to her, and watched as she walked away. She found a spot near the edge of the tent, sat down on the dirt floor and placed Kenji beside her. The boy was coughing, a wet, rattling sound that made Frank wince. Yuriko rubbed his back, whispering to him in Japanese, soothing words Frank couldn't understand but whose meaning was universal. Then she picked up her bowl, lifted the spoon to her mouth, and pretended to eat. Frank saw it clearly. The spoon touched her lips, but she didn't swallow. She lowered the bowl, glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then scooped the rice into Kenji's bowl. The boy ate slowly, mechanically, his small body shaking with each breath. Frank turned away, a knot forming in his stomach. He told himself it wasn't his business, that he couldn't get involved, that there were rules and regulations and a chain of command. But the image stayed with him. That night, lying in his bunk in the guards' barracks, he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Yuriko's face, kept hearing Kenji's cough, kept thinking about his own children back home in Ohio. Tommy was 8 now. Susan was 6. They were safe, well-fed, living with their mother in a small house on Maple Street. Frank hadn't seen them in over 2 years, hadn't held them, hadn't heard their laughter. He missed them with an ache that never went away, a constant pain in his chest that no amount of whiskey or cigarettes could numb. And he thought about what he would do if he were in Yuriko's position. If his children were starving and he had only one bowl of rice, he knew exactly what he'd do. He'd do the same thing she was doing. The next day, Frank watched Yuriko again. Same routine. She took her bowl, sat with Kenji, pretended to eat, then gave him the rest. The boy was so weak he could barely hold the spoon, but he ate every bite, trusting his mother's lie. Frank felt something twist in his chest, a mix of anger and sadness and guilt. He turned to Private Matthew Reynolds, the 19-year-old kid who helped him in the kitchen. Matt was from Tennessee, a farm boy with a thick drawl and a chip on his shoulder. He was a good soldier, followed orders, worked hard, but he was angry, filled with a rage that simmered just beneath the surface. His older brother, Jack, had been killed at Iwo Jima, shot by a Japanese sniper while trying to rescue a wounded Marine. Matt had enlisted 2 weeks after getting the telegram, driven by a need for revenge that consumed him. He'd volunteered for this camp assignment hoping to get some kind of payback, even if it was just serving slop to prisoners and watching them suffer. Frank asked Matt if he'd noticed the woman with the sick kid. Matt glanced over, shrugged, and said he didn't pay attention to their faces, didn't want to. He said they all looked the same to him, just a bunch of defeated enemies who deserved whatever they got. Frank didn't push it. He knew Matt was still grieving, still angry, still looking for someone to blame. Hell, they all were. The war had taken something from everyone, left scars that would never fully heal. But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this war had taken enough from everyone, and maybe it was time to stop taking. On the 6th day, Frank broke protocol. He waited until Yuriko came through the line, her eyes downcast, her movements slow and unsteady. When she held out her bowl, Frank gave her an extra scoop of rice, more than the regulation portion. She looked up at him, startled, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. For a moment they just stared at each other, two people from opposite sides of the world, separated by language and history and war, but connected by something deeper, something human. Frank didn't say anything, just nodded and moved on to the next prisoner. But Matt noticed. After the meal service was over and the prisoners had filed out, Matt confronted Frank in the back of the tent, his face flushed with anger. "Why'd you give that woman extra food?" Matt demanded, his voice tight. "You know the regulations. Everyone gets the same portion, no exceptions." Frank wiped his hands on his apron, choosing his words carefully. "My hand slipped. Gave her too much by accident." "Bullshit," Matt shot back. "I saw you. You did it on purpose. You're giving extra food to the enemy." Frank turned to face him, his jaw set. "She's not the enemy, Matt. She's a mother trying to keep her kid alive. There's a difference." "There's no difference," Matt said, his voice rising. "They're all the enemy. They killed Jack. They killed thousands of our boys, and you're giving them extra food? What the hell is wrong with you?" Frank took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I get it, Matt. I do. I lost friends too. Good men. But that woman in there, she didn't kill anyone. Neither did her kid. They're just trying to survive, same as us." Matt shook his head, his fists clenched. "You're getting soft, Sarge. You're letting them get to you. Next thing you know, you'll be inviting them over for Thanksgiving dinner." Frank didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, leaving Matt standing there, his anger unresolved. That night, Frank couldn't sleep again. He kept thinking about Yuriko, about Kenji, about the lie she told every day. He thought about his own mother, Margaret O'Brien, who'd done the same thing during the Depression. She'd worked 2 jobs, cleaned houses and took in laundry, and still there were nights when there wasn't enough food. Frank remembered coming home from school, hungry and tired, and finding a plate of bread and butter waiting for him. His mother would sit at the table, smiling, telling him she'd already eaten at work. He believed her, just like Kenji believed Yuriko. It wasn't until years later, when he was older, that he realized the truth. She'd been starving herself so he and his siblings could eat. The memory hit Frank like a punch to the gut. He sat up in his bunk, his heart pounding, and made a decision. He couldn't change the war, couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't undo the suffering. But he could do this one small thing. He could help one woman and her son. It wasn't much, but it was something. And maybe, just maybe, it would make a difference. The next morning, Frank went to see Colonel Henry Garrison, the camp commander. Garrison's office was in a small wooden building near the main gate, a sparse room with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a map of Okinawa on the wall. Garrison was a tough, no-nonsense officer, a veteran of the First World War who'd seen more than his share of suffering. He'd fought in the trenches at Belleau Wood, had watched friends die in the mud, had come home with scars both visible and invisible. He ran the camp with efficiency and fairness, following the rules but not without compassion. Frank respected him, trusted him, and hoped he would understand. Frank knocked on the door and entered when Garrison called out. The colonel was sitting at his desk, reading through a stack of reports, a cigarette burning in an ashtray beside him. He looked up, his weathered face showing the exhaustion of a man who carried too much responsibility. "What is it, Sergeant?" Garrison asked, his voice gravelly. Frank stood at attention, then relaxed when Garrison waved him to sit. "Sir, I wanted to talk to you about one of the prisoners, a woman named Yuriko Sato. She's got a sick kid, about 7 years old. Tuberculosis, maybe pneumonia. She's been giving him her food, starving herself to keep him alive. Garrison leaned back in his chair, studying Frank. And you want me to do what exactly? Give her extra rations, sir. Maybe some medicine for the boy. Anything that might help. Garrison was silent for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. Then he sighed and stubbed out his cigarette. I understand your concern, Sergeant. I do. But we have rules, regulations. If we start giving extra food to one prisoner, we'll have to give it to all of them. And we don't have enough supplies for that. The logistics chain is stretched thin as it is. Frank leaned forward, his voice earnest. Sir, this is different. This woman is dying. Her kid is dying. If we don't do something, they won't make it another week. Garrison rubbed his face, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. You think she's the only one? There are 300 people in this camp, Sergeant. Most of them are sick, starving, traumatized. I can't save them all. None of us can. We do what we can with what we have, and we follow the rules. That's all we can do. Frank felt frustration rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. With respect, sir, following the rules isn't always the right thing. Sometimes you have to bend them a little. Do what's right, even if it's not by the book. Garrison looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right, Sergeant. Sometimes you do. But you have to be careful. Start bending the rules too much and everything falls apart. Discipline breaks down, order collapses, and people die. I've seen it happen. He paused, then leaned forward, his voice softer. But I've also seen what happens when you lose your humanity. When you stop caring, stop feeling, stop seeing the people in front of you as human beings. That's when you become the monster you're fighting against. So here's what I'm going to tell you, Sergeant. I can't officially authorize extra rations for one prisoner. But if hypothetically some food happened to go missing from the stores, and if that food happened to end up in the hands of someone who needed it, well, I might not notice. As long as it doesn't become a pattern, as long as it doesn't disrupt operations, I might turn a blind eye. Do you understand what I'm saying? Frank felt a surge of relief. Yes, sir. I understand. Garrison nodded. Good. Now get out of here and get back to work. And Sergeant, be careful. Not everyone in this camp sees things the way we do. Some of these boys are still looking for a fight, still want revenge. Don't give them a reason to cause trouble. Frank stood and saluted. Thank you, sir. As he left the office, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had permission, tacit approval to do what he knew was right. That afternoon, he went back to the mess tent and started setting aside small portions of food. Extra rice, a piece of bread, some vegetables from the soup pot. He wrapped them in cloth and hid them in his jacket. After the evening meal service, when most of the prisoners had returned to their tents and the guards were changing shifts, Frank walked over to where Yuriko and Kenji were sitting. He crouched down beside them, his large frame awkward in the confined space. Yuriko looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. Frank didn't speak Japanese and she didn't speak much English, but he held out the bundle of food and pointed to it, then to her, then to her mouth. He mimed eating, exaggerating the motion so she would understand. Her eyes widened, tears welling up as she realized what he was offering. She took the bundle with trembling hands, bowing her head repeatedly, whispering words Frank couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Frank stood up and walked away quickly, before anyone could see, before his own emotions could overwhelm him. He felt something in his chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't pride, exactly, and it wasn't satisfaction. It was something simpler, something more fundamental, the feeling of having done the right thing. He continued this routine every day for the next 2 weeks. Every evening, after the meal service, he would bring Yuriko extra food. Sometimes it was just a little extra rice, sometimes a piece of fruit scrounged from the officer's mess, sometimes a hard-boiled egg or a biscuit. He never said much, just handed her the food and left. But slowly, things started to change. Yuriko began to gain a little weight, her face less gaunt, her movements less weak and unsteady. Her eyes, once dull and lifeless, began to show a spark of hope. And Kenji, the boy, started to improve. His coughing fits became less frequent, less violent. His color returned, the sickly pallor replaced by a healthier tone. The camp doctor, Lieutenant Peterson, noticed the change and increased Kenji's medication, saying the boy might actually pull through if he continued to improve. Matt Reynolds noticed too. He'd been watching Frank, suspicious of his nightly trips to the prisoner section. Matt couldn't let it go, couldn't understand why Frank would risk everything to help the enemy. One evening he followed Frank at a distance, staying in the shadows, watching as Frank approached Yuriko and handed her the bundle of food. Matt felt a surge of anger, a sense of betrayal. He wanted to confront Frank right there, to drag him back to the barracks and report him to Garrison. But something stopped him. He watched as Yuriko took the food, as she bowed in gratitude, as Frank walked away, and he saw the look on her face, the tears streaming down her cheeks, the desperate relief of a mother who'd been given a lifeline for her dying child. Matt stood there in the darkness, his fists clenched, his mind churning. He thought about his brother Jack, about how he'd died fighting these people, about the hatred that had driven Matt to enlist. But he also thought about his own mother, about how she'd cried when she got the telegram, about how she'd held Matt and told him not to let anger consume him, to remember that Jack had died fighting for something good, something worth protecting, and he wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was what Jack had been fighting for. Not revenge, not hatred, but the chance for people to be decent to each other, to show compassion even in the darkest times. The next day Matt confronted Frank in the kitchen, but this time his anger had cooled, replaced by something else, something more complex. "I saw you last night," Matt said quietly. "Saw you giving food to that woman." Frank tensed, ready for a fight. "Yeah? You going to report me?" Matt shook his head slowly. "No, I'm not. But I don't understand it, Sarge. Why are you doing this? Why risk everything for them?" Frank looked at him, searching for the right words. "Because it's the right thing to do, Matt. Because that woman is a mother and her kid is dying, and if I can help, then I have to. It's not about sides or enemies. It's about being human." Matt was silent for a long moment, then he nodded. "My brother used to say something like that. He said the war wasn't about killing, it was about protecting. Protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. I never really understood what he meant, but maybe I'm starting to." Frank put a hand on Matt's shoulder. "Your brother sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Matt said, his voice thick with emotion. "He really was." That evening, when Frank prepared the bundle of food for Yuriko, Matt helped him. They didn't talk about it, didn't make a big deal out of it. Matt just gathered extra rice, a piece of bread, some vegetables, and wrapped them in cloth. Together, they walked to Yuriko's tent and gave her the food. She looked at both of them, her eyes wide with disbelief and gratitude. She bowed to Frank, then to Matt, whispering her thanks. Matt nodded awkwardly, uncomfortable with the display of emotion, then walked away quickly. But from that day on, he helped Frank every evening. They became a team, two soldiers on a mission of mercy in the middle of a war zone. Word began to spread among the prisoners. They saw Frank and Matt bringing food to Yuriko and Kenji, and they started to see the Americans differently, not as conquerors or enemies, but as human beings capable of kindness. The atmosphere in the camp began to shift, subtly but noticeably. Prisoners who had been sullen and withdrawn started to interact more with the guards, offering small gestures of respect and gratitude. Some of the other guards noticed too, and a few of them started helping. A corporal named Jenkins began setting aside extra blankets for the sick. A private named Ramirez shared cigarettes with the older prisoners, sitting with them and trying to communicate despite the language barrier. Even Colonel Garrison noticed the change, though he never said anything directly. One day he pulled Frank aside and told him the camp was running more smoothly than it had in weeks, that morale was improving on both sides. Frank knew what he meant. Garrison was giving him tacit approval, acknowledging that what Frank was doing was making a difference. By the end of October, Kenji had recovered enough to walk on his own. He was still weak, still thin, but the color had returned to his cheeks, and he no longer coughed blood. The tuberculosis was in remission, held at bay by the medication and, more importantly, by proper nutrition. Yuriko had regained much of her strength too. She started helping the other prisoners, translating for the Americans when they needed to communicate, organizing the distribution of supplies, mediating disputes. She became a bridge between the two groups, a symbol of reconciliation in a place that had been defined by conflict and suffering. One afternoon, Frank was walking through the camp when he saw Yuriko teaching Kenji to write English words in the dirt with a stick. The boy was kneeling beside her, his small face scrunched in concentration as he carefully traced the letters. C-A-T, dog, H-O-M-E. Yuriko was smiling, encouraging him. praising his efforts. Kenji looked up at her and laughed, a bright, joyful sound that seemed out of place in the grim surroundings. Frank stopped and watched them, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He thought about his own children, about Tommy and Susan learning to read and write, about the world they would inherit, and he wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something better, a chance for people to see past their differences, past their anger and grief, and recognize the humanity in each other. As the weeks turned into months, the camp began to change in more fundamental ways. The prisoners were gradually released, sent to relocation centers where they could be reunited with family members, or allowed to return to their villages if they had homes to go back to. The process was slow, hampered by bureaucracy and the massive scale of the displacement, but it was happening. Yuriko and Kenji were among the last to leave. They had no home to return to. Their village had been destroyed in the battle, their house reduced to rubble, but arrangements were being made to send them to a relocation center in the north, where they could start rebuilding their lives. On their final day at the camp, Yuriko approached Frank as he was cleaning up after the morning meal. She walked slowly, Kenji holding her hand, both of them looking healthier and stronger than they had in months. Frank saw them coming and set down the pot he was scrubbing. Yuriko stopped in front of him and bowed deeply, a formal gesture of respect and gratitude. Then she reached into the pocket of her kimono and pulled out a small piece of cloth. It was embroidered with a delicate image, a cherry blossom in full bloom, its petals rendered in pink and white thread. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the work of someone who had spent hours on this tiny piece of art. She held it out to Frank, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said in halting English, the words carefully practiced. "You save my son. You save me. This, for you, to remember." Frank took the cloth, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to say something to tell her that she'd saved him too, that her courage and love had reminded him why he'd become a soldier in the first place. Not to kill, but to protect, to help, to make a difference. But the words wouldn't come. His eyes were burning, tears threatening to spill over, and he didn't trust his voice. So he just nodded, holding the embroidered cherry blossom carefully as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Because in that moment, it was. Yuriko smiled, a sad, grateful smile, then turned and walked away, Kenji beside her. Frank watched them go, watched as they climbed into the back of a transport truck with other released prisoners, watched as the truck drove through the camp gate and disappeared down the muddy road. He stood there for a long time, the cherry blossom clutched in his hand, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had changed. That night, Frank sat in his bunk and wrote a letter to his wife, Mary. He told her about Yuriko and Kenji, about the choice he'd made, about the small act of kindness that had changed everything. He wrote about how the war had hardened him, how he'd forgotten what it meant to be human, how he'd been consumed by anger, grief, and loss. But he also wrote about hope, about the possibility of redemption, about the belief that even in the darkest times there was still light. He wrote about the cherry blossom Yuriko had given him, about what it symbolized: beauty and fragility, life persisting even after devastation. He ended the letter with a promise. When he came home, he would be a better man, a better father, a better husband. He would remember the lesson Yuriko had taught him, that love and sacrifice were the most powerful forces in the world, stronger than hate, stronger than war. Matt Reynolds read over Frank's shoulder as he wrote. He didn't say anything, but Frank could see the understanding in the young soldier's eyes. Matt had changed too. The anger that had consumed him had faded, replaced by something softer, something more human. He still grieved for his brother, still carried the pain of loss, but he'd learned that hatred only bred more suffering. He'd learned that compassion was the truest form of strength. Frank O'Brien returned home to Ohio in December 1945. He never saw Yuriko or Kenji again, though he searched for them years later when he revisited Okinawa. But he carried the embroidered cherry blossom with him always, a reminder that even in war's darkest moments, humanity could prevail. He passed that lesson to his children and they to theirs, a quiet legacy of compassion. The story of Yuriko Sato and Frank O'Brien is small in the vast history of World War II, but it matters. It reminds us that war is about people, about choices we make when everything is stripped away. It's about moments when we choose kindness over cruelty, compassion over hatred, love over fear. Those moments define us. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep these stories alive. In a world still filled with conflict, we need to remember that beneath our differences, we are all the same. We all love, we all suffer, we all hope. And sometimes, one person, one small act of kindness, changes everything.